94 calls to action to address the legacy of residential schools and achieve true reconciliation based on the experience and recommendations of survivors. Our government is committed to implementing each and every one of these calls to action. The legislation responds to call to actions number 53 to 56. The final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded that, quote, all levels of government must make a new commitment to reconciliation and accountability, end quote. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission further noted that Indigenous peoples and Canadians will benefit from the establishment of an oversight body to evaluate and report on progress made toward fulfilling commitments and to ensure that the necessary educational resources to advance reconciliation are available to Canadians. On this journey, it is crucial that we listen, truly listen, to the stories of those who have been affected by our history. These stories, though often fraught with pain and injustice, are vital to understanding the depth of hurt that has been caused. They remind us that behind every call to action, there are human faces and stories that deserve to be heard and acknowledged. To that end, this bill was brought forward after extensive engagement with Indigenous peoples and organizations. Our government, as well as parliamentarians in both chambers, have worked tirelessly to ensure that the bill before us today is at the heart of what Indigenous people have been asking for in this country. And parliamentarians have made important amendments, of which the government accepts all of them. Madam Speaker, walking the path of reconciliation requires consistent action and a desire to forge a new relationship based on mutual respect, trust, and nation-to-nation recognition to which Indigenous peoples are entitled. This work is vital, complex, and long-term. That is why it is crucial that we have systems to measure the progress we are making as a country as we work towards reconciliation, and that we hold the government accountable to its objectives. The Council would do just that. Reconciliation requires more than just words. It demands action. It challenges us to move beyond mere acknowledgement of past injustices to the implementation of concrete steps that address these wrongs. While the Leader of the Opposition offers platitudes on the necessity of reconciliation, there remains a stark contrast between his rhetoric and the actions, or lack thereof, taken by his party. Madam Speaker, that is why the National Council for Reconciliation is so important. It would be an independent, permanent body that would oversee the progress of reconciliation efforts in Canada. It aims to promote respect, dialogue, and understanding between Canadian and Indigenous peoples. The Council would provide oversight and hold the government accountable for advancing reconciliation with Indigenous communities, including monitoring and evaluating the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. We know progress has been made, but I hope that everyone in this place would agree that there is more to do. As amended, this bill strengthens the accountability of governments to respond to Council concerns in terms of measuring progress. The establishment of such a Council reflects a commitment to creating mechanisms for ongoing dialogue, respect for Indigenous rights, and concerted effort to address historical injustices and the legacy of colonialism. It signifies a step forward in the journey toward reconciliation, aiming to ensure that the actions and policies of the future are informed by a comprehensive understanding of the past and present realities faced by Indigenous peoples in Canada. I encourage my colleagues to support the bill as amended, as it represents a critical step towards bridging the gap between words and action. Miigwech, kuya namik, merci, thank you, merci.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And you know, I think I want to thank my colleague for his comments, and I do feel that the implementation of the calls to action certainly need oversight, because the final report from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation came out in 2015, and this government has barely moved on it. I appreciated his comments, particularly about acknowledging history, particularly because we are at a time where there is a rise of residential school denialism. In fact, the Conservative leader, the member of Carleton, on the day when we were meeting with families searching the landfill, he was meeting with and doing fundraising, in fact, with a group that espouses or puts out articles regularly citing residential school denialism, particularly with the unmarked graves. I'm wondering what my colleague thinks about a need for legislation to amend, put in place legislation to deal with residential school denialism as a form of hate speech.
The honourable member for the Honourable Government Deputy House Leader.
It's certainly a tough question to answer in terms of whether or not legislation is required for that, Madam Speaker. But, I would suggest that, unfortunately, we live in a day and age where misinformation is spread so wildly. We don't even seem to have a standard by which whom is willing to distribute that information in this day and age. I think at the heart of this is information and in making sure that Canadians know exactly what happened. We have a very difficult past to reconcile with, Madam Speaker. We have the obligation to ensure that we do everything that we possibly can. And I would even, go as far to say that this is why this legislation is so important. If a council is established permanently as an act of this Parliament, it becomes much more difficult for a potential future government to dismantle it, and therefore that council will continue to exist in perpetuity to be able to monitor the progress of the calls to action.
Questions and comments? The Honourable for Caribou Prince George.
I'm quite dismayed at the comment from our NDP colleague across the way, but I'll leave that for another day. It's par for the course with this NDP team that they have. One question to our colleague across the way. Why was the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, an organization that represents 800 status and non-status off-reserve urban Indigenous peoples and the Native Women's Association of Canada, not included in this program?
The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Well, Madam Speaker, I don't have an answer to his specific question in terms of the particular organizations that he's referencing. What I do know is that, and as I indicated in my speech, there was an absolute ton of work done into creating this commission, into consulting with Indigenous peoples directly. I'm a partisan person, Madam Speaker. I think you would acknowledge that. When I get up in this House, I'm quite partisan. I will take the shots where I see necessary. I just really hope that on this particular issue, on an issue as important as this is something that the entire House can be supportive of. We're talking about establishing a council here with oversight. I really hope that we can put aside the partisanship of this and move forward in doing what's right, because I know at heart every member believes that.
The Honourable Member for Rivière-de-Miville. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and good morning. Madam Speaker, C-29 corresponds to what the Bloc Québécois has been considering for a long time, a nation-to-nation relationship, and it is really part of our values, and we support this. And there was an agreement signed by Premier by Quebec Premier, and I would like to say that in 2024, this is an act called there was an act called the Indian Act, and I think it's completely unacceptable. It's unfair and discriminatory. And I would like to hear my colleague on that.
Country Secretary.
It's certainly off topic in terms of this particular bill, but I'm happy to answer that question. I would completely agree that having an act with that name in 2024, we should be moving in the direction of replacing that and in probably updating legislation in the process.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak on the legislation that provides for the establishment of a National Council of Reconciliation. It would be an independent, non-political, permanent, and Indigenous-led organization whose purpose is to advance efforts for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. This council will track our progress on implementing the calls to action, a roadmap for reconciliation. I wish to reiterate that we are committed to implementing the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, advancing reconciliation, and working in partnership with the First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. We will implement all of the calls to action and advancing reconciliation in partnership with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. We recognize the crucial role played by the Senate of Canada, often referred to as the Chamber of Sober Second Thoughts. This body serves as a vital check on the legislative process, ensuring that laws enacted by the House of Commons receive thorough review and consideration. The Senate's recent amendments to a key piece of legislation exemplify its essential function. By refining terms, clarifying language, and specifying functions, the Senate has not only enhanced the clarity of the law, but also its effectiveness in serving the diverse needs of Canadians, particularly emphasizing respect and precision in matters involving Indigenous governing bodies. The amendments, such as the explicit use of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in the preamble, focus on inclusivity and acknowledgement of Canada's Indigenous peoples. They also improve governance by defining the scope and functions of the new Council and by ensuring transparency through the tabling of an annual report. These adjustments are crucial for meaningful consultation and cooperation with Indigenous communities. Let us value and respect the Senate's diligent work. Their amendments contribute significantly to making legislation more just, more precise, and better suited to serve our society's needs. The Senate's thoughtful revisions ensure that our laws reflect the voices and rights of all Canadians. Indigenous people in Canada, comprising First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, represent diverse and vibrant cultures with distinct traditions, languages, and histories. Today, these groups face a complex set of challenges and opportunities. Socially and economically, Indigenous people often experience high rates of poverty, lower educational attainment, health disparities, and limited access to essential services compared to non-Indigenous Canadians. These issues are rooted in historical injustice such as colonization and the residential school system. However, there is ongoing progress in addressing these challenges. Recent years have seen increased governmental and public recognition of Indigenous rights and sovereignty. Efforts towards reconciliation are evident in initiatives like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, which aim to rectify historical wrongs. Indigenous political and cultural resurgence is also notable, with Indigenous leaders playing key roles in national dialogues about environmental protection, economic development, and cultural preservation. Imagine a Canada when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action are fully realized, a nation defined by understanding, justice, and mutual respect. The impact of implementing these calls is profound, promising a future where all Canadians, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, share equally in the prosperity and the cultural richness of our country. By acknowledging and correcting the historical and systemic injustice faced by Indigenous peoples, we foster a national spirit of genuine reconciliation. This means not only recognizing past wrongs, but actively working to rectifying them. Education systems will teach the true history of Indigenous peoples, fostering understanding and respect from a young age. Health and justice systems will be reformed to eliminate systemic biases, ensuring that Indigenous communities receive equitable treatment. The economic impact will be significant as well. By supporting Indigenous businesses and integrating traditional knowledge into our economic practices, we unlock new opportunity for innovation and sustainability. Socially, as barriers are dismantled, we will see stronger, more inclusive communities across Canada, enriched by the diverse cultures and traditions of Indigenous peoples. This is not just an investment in the future of Indigenous communities, but in the future of all Canadians, creating a society that truly reflects our values of fairness and equality. These are the reasons why I stand before you to discuss the imperative of fully implementing the calls to action of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This comprehensive report is not merely a document. It is a blueprint for healing and partnership aimed at righting the historical injustices faced by Indigenous peoples in Canada. For too long, the voices of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities have been marginalized. The residential school system, a dark chapter in our national history, stripped away language, culture, and identity. The calls to action provide us a path to acknowledge these painful truths, to learn from them, and to avoid repeating mistakes of the past. Implementing these calls to action is not just a moral obligation, it is a vital step building a just society where the rights and cultures of Indigenous peoples are respected. It is about creating educational programs that reflect the true history of Canada, reforming the justice system to be equitable, and ensuring health and child welfare services meet the needs of Indigenous communities. Let us embrace this opportunity to foster reconciliation, to build bridges, and to work hand in hand with Indigenous communities towards a shared and equitable future. The path is laid out before us. It is time for action, commitment, and perseverance. Let us move forward, not as separate entities, but as united Canadians, honoring every chapter of our shared history. The Council, as outlined in Bill C-29, will be an independent, non-partisan body dedicated to overseeing the ongoing efforts towards reconciliation. It marks a profound shift towards ensuring that these efforts are led by those who understand them deeply, our Indigenous peoples. Notably, the Board of Directors, primarily composed of Indigenous members.
I have a point of order. The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Just a friendly reminder not to refer to Indigenous people as our Indigenous people, because we're not pets. Thanks.
I apologize, Madam Speaker.
Okay. The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the honourable member for pointing that out. I sincerely apologize. It was a mistake on my part. Notably, the Board of Directors, primarily composed of Indigenous members, will include representatives nominated by major Indigenous organizations, ensuring a broad and inclusive range of voices in guiding the Council's mission. This legislation empowers the Council to monitor and evaluate our nation's progress in addressing the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The annual report produced by the Council and the Prime Minister mandate response will ensure transparency and accountability, providing a clear measure of our progress. By incorporating the Council under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, we are also ensuring that it has a solid structural and legal foundation to operate effectively and independently. The path to reconciliation is long and challenging, but with the establishment of the National Council for Reconciliation, we reaffirm our commitment to a just and equitable future. Let us move forward with renewed dedication and hope. In the coming years, the status of Indigenous peoples in Canada is anticipated to reflect significant advancements in reconciliation and self-determination. Building on current trends, there will likely be greater acknowledgement and implementation of Indigenous rights with increased political representation and leadership across various sectors. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
And I'd like to thank the member for his presentation, his intervention. I think that this bill, while it's important, is definitely not enough. And it was so unfortunate that when the Minister of Finance did her budget presentation, she didn't even mention reconciliation with Indigenous people. She didn't even mention Indigenous peoples. And I wonder if this member agrees that this Liberal government needs to really show its action and not just use symbolism when it comes to working with Indigenous peoples, when it comes to reconciliation, because when this government doesn't even increase enough what we need to do to uplift Indigenous peoples out of poverty that he mentioned, that that marginalization didn't end when residential schools ended, that marginalization is allowed to continue because governments like this Liberal government continue to underinvest in Indigenous peoples.
The Honourable Member for Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I agree with the Honourable Member that this legislation is not just enough. This is a path towards doing what is right, what is just, and we have been doing it for the last 8.5 years. We have shown our real commitment in actually taking steps, concrete steps, implementing a lot of steps, and I agree, there's still much more work to do.
Député de Laurentides-Labelle.
Member for Laurentides-Labelle. The member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles asked a question a moment ago, and he said there's not enough being done with this Indian Act. Does he agree that we need to make it a priority to show that if we truly want things to change, does my colleague agree with what his predecessor said?
The Honourable Member for Nepean.
Madam Speaker, I repeat that we have shown our real commitment, not just in words, but in action during the last 8.5 years. We have made it a point, and the things that we have done during the last 8.5 years, the things we are doing with this particular bill shows our real commitment in doing what is just and what is right.
The questions and comments? The Honourable for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd have to disagree with, I guess my honourable colleagues bragging about everything his government did. I mean, the budget just came out, no mention of Indigenous people, and they actually put more money into auto theft than they did into the crisis of MMIWG, which sends a very clear message, as I pointed out to the minister, that Canada cares more about finding cars than it does about finding Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals. That doesn't look like reconciliation to me. I'd also like to point out that there's more kids now in care than at the height of residential schools, partly because of ongoing systemic racism, which has been reported. This government has been in power 8 years since the Truth and Reconciliation report was released in 2015. 8 years, and now they're just putting in place an oversight body after 10 years. Give me a break. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague if he's willing to be honest and admit that his government needs to do more if he's going to achieve reconciliation in this country.
The honourable member for Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have to respectfully disagree with that member. The cumulative amount that we have invested towards the Indigenous people's needs during the last 8.5 years is out there, it's public. We can see the commitment that we have shown, we have done. But I agree with that there is more needs to be done. We have been doing it and we will continue to do it.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for, I have a point of order, the honourable member for Saskatoon University.
Yes, Madam Speaker. Last night I referenced 4 documents in a speech concerning wet, limp, and utterly useless paper straws. I'd like to table the 4 studies that show that it's worse for your environment, waste for your...
The honourable member already, I hear no's. There's no unanimous consent. Resuming debate. Order. Resuming debate. The honourable member Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a
I want to remind the honourable member he asked his question. I gave him an answer, and I also want to remind the honourable parliamentary secretary that if he wishes to have a further conversation on this between the two, then they should step out. The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I rise to speak to Bill C-29, an act to provide for the establishment of National Council for Reconciliation. Reconciliation. What does that word mean? In 9 years of this government, what we have seen is the word reconciliation, I believe, just become a buzzword. Reconciliation is about walking shoulder to shoulder by listening, by learning, by being open to admitting wrongs were done. C-29 is in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action 53 to 56. I'll remind this House that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was founded by our former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, our former government, Conservative government. Now, throughout these conversations, there's always finger pointing that goes on. And I would hazard that there's enough blame to go around from all sides. And Speaker, we have seen in the last 9 years through this government picking winners and losers, First Nation pitted against First Nation, First Nations pitted against non-First Nations, Métis versus Métis, Métis versus non-Métis. We have seen our Prime Minister thank Indigenous protesters who are just protesting simply the fact that the boil water advisories in their communities still are ongoing. And what did he do when they were at his fancy function? Is he thanked them for their donation. We've seen him cast away the first Indigenous female Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who spoke truth to power and was cast aside, Madam Speaker. We have seen this Prime Minister who has stood there with his hand on his heart and dabbing away a fake tear with a tissue, saying this is his most important relationship. And yet, as we've just heard, they just launched their 9th budget and not a mention of reconciliation for Indigenous peoples. So pardon me if we seemed a bit skeptical about what they're planning with C-29. Now, Speaker, over the time of my being elected, whether it's my current file in mental health and suicide prevention, or previous files, transportation, or fisheries, this government likes to say that they've consulted. And is it really truly consultation or engagement, or is it simply merely checking the tick box, or a check mark in a box on a sheet saying this is what you have to say and you have to complete? True engagement means sitting at the table and fully understanding all sides. What brought us to this point? Recent years, we've heard the horrors of our residential school program, but the world is just waking up to what some of us have heard for many years. The horrors that were our residential school program, a program that was designed to drive the Indian out of the children. Thousands upon thousands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children taken from their homes and never returned. Now, Speaker, if you've ever sat with a residential school survivor, if you ever listened to their stories, it is horrible. The start of the ground sonar search in my riding of Caribou Prince George, the ground sonar search at the former St. Joseph's Mission School, residential school in my hometown of Williams Lake. I'm on record as speaking that I grew up just down the road from this school, and yet I had no idea of the horrors that were going on at that school. These were kids that I played with, that many of them I know to this day that are my friends, indeed are my family, as my family is First Nations as well. But watching a residential school survivor come to the lands for a ceremony marking the start of the ground sonar search, and watching them shake as those memories, and become so emotional as those memories come flooding back. It's absolutely heartbreaking. You know, in 9 years of this government, they have only fully implemented 11 of the 94 calls to action, and only 8 of the 76 calls that are the federal government's responsibility. Why did it take 4 years for the Liberals to implement this after the Prime Minister made the announcement about it in 2018? Why are they still not bringing in or listening to all of the Indigenous groups that want to be part of this? The Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, an organization that represents over 800 status and non-status off-reserve urban Indigenous peoples, and the Native Women's Association of Canada, an organization that represents women and children on and off reserve. At the committee, our Conservative team, Bloc and NDP, passed the motion to include these 2 national organizations at Council. However, when the rubber hit the road, when it really came time to make sure that they were part of it, our NDP colleagues sided with our Liberal friends, their Liberal friends, and voted to exclude the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, effectively silencing the voices of 800,000 off-reserve Indigenous peoples. Why? Reconciliation is about inclusion. Reconciliation is about recognizing economic prosperity, allowing our Indigenous peoples to recognize, or allowing Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities to recognizing full potential. This is unbelievable that we're still debating this bill. The fact that this bill is still here, the fact that we're still in the process of debating it after having numerous amendments, speeches, just speaks to the government's failure to meaningfully consult and advance this issue. Now, they're going to stand up and say that I guarantee you we're going to hear it at one point that it's been blocked, there's been lots of dilatory motions from this side. They have the majority, Madam Speaker. If they want to push something through with their NDP colleagues, they can push it through. Now, our Conservative colleagues worked diligently at the committee to improve the bill. Isn't that the message we always say? Just let it pass. Let's get it to committee, and we'll make it better there. But again, what we've heard that they blocked and they left out those two important groups. We talk about consultation. Does it really truly represent the work that they've done, or the consultation that's done? Does it truly represent all the Indigenous people, or does it just simply reflect the views and those that are friends of this Liberal government? We know recently that there are about 113 Indigenous groups in Ontario that are taking this government to court over boil water advisories. This government talks a good game, Madam Speaker, but the truth is in their actions. As important as this bill is, it also highlights the failure of a Liberal government to listen to Canadians and to listen meaningful and to consult with Indigenous peoples. This is, of course, not the first time we've spoken about the Liberals' inability to consult and listen. They always seem to just go down the path and tick the boxes of the groups that are in agreement with them, and they use that as their record of consultation. Yet they have left a whole section, a whole community of Indigenous peoples out in this when it pertains to C-29. You know, here's a concern that we have, is that time and again we see these bills that come forth and it's not perfect, and then the consequences are faced afterwards. Now, you'll hear comments from the other side that say, well, we should never let perfection get in the way of getting something done. You know, I've talked about winners and losers with this government. I want to talk about my friend Chief Willie Sellers in Williams Lake. Here's a chief of his community that, in all sense of the word, is leading by example. Isn't waiting for the government to provide handouts, has done everything to lead his nation and his community to economic prosperity. Alice Ross, a provincial MLA in British Columbia, walks the walk. I remember sitting in a meeting or a presentation with him about 10 years ago, and he said this: we don't need all these fancy words. We don't need to listen to an unelected group, the United Nations, the calls to action. He says, what we need is government to get out of the way, to allow us to chart our own path forward. You know, is this council going to be yet just another arm of the minister of the day? These are questions that we have. Will this government even listen to the National Council? They've spent the last 9 years of over-promising and under-delivering on Indigenous issues. How many communities still have the boil water advisories? It's unbelievable to this day. I remember one of the first speeches that we did in this House, one of the first emergency debates that we had was the suicide epidemic on Attawapiskat First Nation. Speaker. And it was heartbreaking for me to hear the stories that we were hearing. Sadly, have things gotten better for Indigenous peoples in the last 9 years under this government? When in 2015 the Prime Minister stood and promised that this was his most important relationship. It is complex. I will give them that. But if it truly was his most important relationship, when they just announced so much spending in a budget that we now spend more money servicing our debt than we do on health care, and the books were open, the safe was open, they were throwing money at everything, yet not a mention of Indigenous peoples or reconciliation. It's frustrating. And what will be measured with this council? What gets measured gets done. So Conservatives will be supporting this bill because we believe in the premise that we have to have everyone around the table. That true reconciliation begins with understanding, begins with, as I said earlier on, listening. Open heart, open ears, open eyes. My concern with this government is that this is just yet another, as I said earlier on, just to placate those. There's no real meaning or value behind doing this. It's frustrating that we're here. I've already mentioned this once earlier on in my speech. It's frustrating that we're debating this today when this could have been done previously. 9 years, as I get heckled from the other side. 9 years they've had to get this done. And now, in the 11th hour of the last few shreds of power that they have, they put this forward. It's taken forever for them to do this. Madam Speaker, with that being said, as I mentioned, we will be supporting this bill. We hope that we can see some amendments being done that we put forth. We hope that all Indigenous peoples are included at the table. The Congress, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, as well as the Native Women's Association of Canada, are two organizations that we feel should be included in this. and should have a say, at least one director around the table. And with that, Madam Speaker, I thank you for this time. I thank you for the colleagues for listening, and I'll take the questions. Thanks.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre, I know she's waiting for her lights, wrong lights. Oh, there we go.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And I have to say, I appreciate the empathy from, my honourable colleague. But, the Conservatives have quite a history. If we want to talk about their history with reconciliation, I'll start with former Prime Minister Harper, who said that MMIWG wasn't on his radar. Tanya Capo, who's an Indigenous lawyer, said in a span of a week, the Conservative government confirmed their feelings of indifference, disregard, and utter lack of respect for Indigenous people. Fast forward to today with their current leader, the member from Carleton, the current leader of the Conservative Party, who actively fraternizes with residential school denialists. In fact, article titled Polyev Delivers Speech to a Group Criticized for Residential School Denialism, to which the former national chief of the AFN said, I condemn any association with denialist views and the deep hurt they cause to our survivors and their families, Archibald said in a media statement. He himself has had to apologize in the past for minimizing and denying the impacts of residential school, to which he had to apologize when he was a minister. Do you want to talk about 9 years? I want to talk about before the last 9 years. I'm not saying this government is doing a good job, but it's pretty rich for the Conservatives to sit there when their leader actively fraternizes with residential school denialists and talk about how they care about Indigenous people. I'd like my honourable colleague, if he will acknowledge the level of denialism that his party participates in.
Yeah. I do want to remind members, I'm hearing these side conversations about, the opportunity that the speaker gives to members, and I just want to indicate to those individuals, I look at the room to see how many people are getting up for questions and comments, and I base the decision as to how much time to allow on that. And so I just want to remind members that I am paying time, and I will actively indicate when it's time to end the question and when it's time to answer the question. The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yeah, it's disappointing. Madam Speaker, to hear the comments from our colleague across down the way, Madam Speaker. It's interesting. I always say that those in glass houses should not throw rocks, Madam Speaker, and I would say this is that it was our former Prime Minister Stephen Harper that started the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I can say this, that I've never seen Prime Minister be more indignant. On one hand, stand here before cameras, whenever the cameras were on, say that this is his most important relationship, and then absolutely turn away and shun our first Indigenous female Attorney General, a person who is a dear and close friend of mine. I've seen over the last 9 years the damage that this Prime Minister has done within Indigenous communities, pitting Indigenous community against Indigenous community, pitting Indigenous community against non-Indigenous community. I've seen this Prime Minister smirk and smile when hearing the plights of those in our gala or in our House talking about their communities and the Indigenous peoples within their communities and that they are a part of. I'll remind my colleague that this is a government that's in power. This is a government that made a tremendous amount of promises in 9 years previously. over the last 9 years and that have failed at every step. This is a Prime Minister that thanked Indigenous protesters simply protesting the fact that they do not have boiled water in their communities, or potable water in their communities. You have to boil.
I gave the honourable member the same amount of time as I gave the question, and we need to have other questions. I see other people have decided to stand and rise. The honourable questions and comments, the honourable minister.
Madam Speaker, and I was listening to the member's speech with interest, and I would first of all say that it's encouraging to hear that the Conservatives are considering supporting this legislation, given that they did not support the passage of the UN Declaration Act. So having heard that from this member and other members in the Conservative Party, would the member commit to allowing this bill to carry on the voices today so that we don't have to wait another week to vote on it?
Member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My honourable colleague knows full well that that is a discussion at House leadership and not one that I can speak to. Madam Speaker, it's disappointing that this is a minister of the Crown and a minister of this file, and that it has taken them 4 years to get to this point, Madam Speaker, and one that I have a great deal of respect for in terms of the work that we did with respect to 988 and the mental health of Canadians, but one that she has stumbled into this file and has stumbled along the way, likely because of the leadership or lack thereof of our Prime Minister.
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher Les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his empathetic speech. We see that he cares deeply about Indigenous peoples and that he cares deeply about reconciliation. I'm glad that he'll be voting in favor of C-29. Now, although the Conservatives are not in power, they're in opposition, they could still do some things to promote reconciliation. For example, not long ago, we saw the Conservative leader participate in a major celebration of John A. Macdonald, the man who hung Louis Riel and set up residential schools and caused famine among First Nations. Does my colleague really think that this kind of celebration is appropriate in a reconciliation context?
Madam Speaker, it's interesting we get these questions from the Bloc and from others talking about the past and when we're looking forward to the future. Madam Speaker, we're here today to talk about a bill, C-29, which we all agree is important and needed. Madam Speaker, and unfortunately, we have parties that just want to continue point fingers, doing everything, taking a very nonpartisan piece of legislation and turning it into a partisan hit job.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I really do appreciate the words from my colleague from northern British Columbia. I know he represents a number of First Nations and Métis in his riding and does a fantastic job bringing their voices here to Ottawa, and you saw that reflected in his speech. I think my question to him revolves around this piece of legislation, specifically the fact that the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, despite representing a large number of Indigenous people living off reserve, when you're talking about those living off the First Nations, they represent status, non-status, Métis, and yet they are left off the founding table that then dictates the path going forward. And that is something I think we advocated strongly for in committee, and unfortunately the government didn't listen, so I'd like to get his comments on that. Thank you, Speaker.
Honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is disappointing. We know that there is a very large community of Indigenous youth, status and non-status youth living off reserve and within urban centres and families that live off reserve. Our family is one of them, and yet this government has chosen to leave the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, an organization that represents over 800,000 status and non-status Indigenous peoples, as well as the Native Women's Association of Canada, an organization that represents women and children on and off reserve. But it is, Madam Speaker, it is par for the course. We see this time and time again with this government, that they chose to pick winners and losers, and they've done the same with C-29. It's disappointing.
Statements by members, déclaration de député. The honourable member for Mississauga Lakeshore.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to recognize the 50th anniversary of the Carnation Revolution, also referred to as Freedom Day in Portugal. At the crack of dawn on April 25, 1974, songs of liberty played over radio. It marked the start of what became known as the Bloodless Revolution. As the army stood guard at the capital, children began placing carnations in the barrels of soldiers' rifles. That love and compassion tugged at the hearts of citizens and generals alike. By day's end, the people peacefully triumphed over a fascist regime, ending 40 years of totalitarian rule. Portugal and its diaspora around the world gathered to celebrate 25 de Abril, based on values of liberty, equality, and the rule of law. It is also a reminder for all of us that democracy and freedom must prevail. To my fellow Portuguese across Canada, feliz dia de liberdade.
The member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. After 9 Liberal Pinocchio budgets and 9 straight deficits where every Liberal projection has been wrong, this NDP Liberal government is still not worth the cost. After 9 years, we have a new Liberal double-double. NDP Liberals have doubled the cost of government, doubled Canada's debt, doubled the taxes Canadians pay, doubled the interest on Canada's debt, and doubled the cost of rent and mortgages. Our government services twice as good, as our health care twice as good, as defence and national security twice as good. The answer, of course, is all or worse. Liberals have added more debt to Canada than all other governments combined in our history, and now Canadians pay $44 billion in interest on the Canadian credit card. And the Liberal budget plan will drive this number to $60 billion in 5 years. Today, that's more money than we spend on health care. After 9 years, the Prime Minister is not worth the cost. But there's good news. Common sense Conservatives will replace Liberal hurt with Conservative hope. We will axe the tax, build the home.
Honourable member for Oakville North, Burlington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Organ donation saves lives. One organ donor can save up to 8 lives. However, less than 25% of people living in Canada are registered donors, even though 90% of Canadians say they support organ donation. In Ontario, 1,400 people on average are waiting for a life-saving organ, with thousands more needing transformative tissue donation. And sadly, every 3 days, someone will die waiting. Thanks to a private member's bill put forward by my colleague from Calgary Confederation, becoming an organ donor in Canada is easier than ever. Ontario residents like me are able to tick a box on our tax return indicating whether or not we'd like to become an organ and tissue donor. 2.5 million Canadians in Ontario and Nunavut since 2022 have indicated their intention. I encourage all provinces and territories to sign up for this life-saving initiative. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Madam Speaker, more than 165,000 new cases of traumatic brain injury occur annually in Canada. In fact, this current number is likely underestimated because of underreporting of cases stemming from concussions, intimate partner violence, combat injuries, and survival of toxic substance poisoning. Beyond the significant physical damage that people experience from traumatic brain injury, we know there is a link between brain injury and further challenges with mental health, substance misuse, homelessness, and incarceration. It is necessary to support education and prevention measures and interventions. My honourable colleague for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford has brought forward Bill C-277 to establish a national strategy on Brain Injuries Act. The legislation is driven by the support of so many living with brain injuries and organizations like the Nanaimo Brain Injury Society, who provide tremendous support and advocacy. I urge all honourable members to add their support to the voices calling for a national strategy on brain injuries. Thank you, Madam Speaker.